August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Empire of Japan. Dawn breaks over unsuspecting city below. B-29. Enola Gay approaches target coordinates. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched behind the Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun, steam rising from his rice bowl in the cool morning air. Around him, the gunners of the 121st Anti-Aircraft Regiment shared breakfast and crude jokes about the American bombers they called aluminum overcast. The men had grown comfortable with their morning routine, watching B-29 superfortresses lumber across Japanese skies like silver whales, too high, too fast, and too well defended for effective interception. Their laughter echoed across the gun emplacement as Private Sato mimicked the sound of American engines sputtering under Japanese fire. "Look at them," Yamamoto pointed skyward with his chopsticks, watching 3 distant contrails streak across the dawn horizon. Flying coffins. The Americans send these giants to terrorize us, but they cannot even hit what they aim for. His confidence was born from 8 months of survival. Since November 1944, when B-29 seconds first appeared over Tokyo, Japanese defenders had watched hundreds of the massive bombers fall to fighters, flak, and mechanical failure. The psychological effect was intoxicating. If these were America's best weapons, victory remained possible. The mathematics seemed to support their optimism. Between November 1944 and July 1945, Japanese forces had claimed 414 B-29 seconds destroyed over the home islands, though American records showed actual losses of 169 superfortresses. Even the conservative American figures represented billions of dollars in aircraft and thousands of training hours lost. Each B-29 cost $639,000 to manufacture, more than the annual budget of many Japanese military units. When one burned and crashed, taking its 10-man crew with it, the psychological victory seemed worth entire squadrons of Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura of the 244th Fighter Squadron had personally witnessed 6 B-29 seconds destroyed, their aluminum hulks scattered across rice paddies like broken toys. "They are too big, too slow," he told his pilots during morning briefings. American engineers built magnificent targets, not weapons of war. The Boeing engineers in Seattle had indeed created the largest production bomber ever built, 99 feet long, with a 141-foot wingspan, weighing 133,500 pounds fully loaded. To Japanese pilots, accustomed to nimble fighters weighing 6,000 pounds, the B-29 appeared impossibly cumbersome. The superfortress's defensive armament seemed impressive on paper: 12 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon in 5 remote-controlled turrets. But Japanese pilots had learned to exploit its blind spots. The aircraft's belly was vulnerable during climbing turns, and coordinated attacks from multiple directions could overwhelm the gunners. Flight Sergeant Matsumoto had discovered that diving attacks from directly ahead, though suicidal, could disable the forward turret before defensive fire became effective. 3 B-29 seconds had fallen to his guns using this technique. The bombing accuracy that terrified American planners delighted Japanese defenders. High-altitude bombing from 30,000 feet, even with the sophisticated Norden bomb sight, scattered ordnance across square miles of countryside. Entire formations would drop their loads on empty fields, missing industrial targets by kilometers. The psychological effect on civilians was significant, but material damage remained manageable. Japanese industrial production, while declining, had not collapsed under B-29 attacks as American strategists predicted. Weather provided another ally to Japanese defenders. The jet stream winds at bombing altitude, unknown to American meteorologists until discovered over Japan, pushed bombs miles off target. Formations arriving over Nagoya would find their carefully calculated bomb runs scattered by 200 mile-per-hour winds. Entire raids would return to bases in the Marianas, having accomplished nothing but burning expensive aviation fuel. The logistical challenge of B-29 operations from bases 1,500 miles away seemed unsustainable to Japanese intelligence analysts. Each mission required 28,000 gallons of aviation fuel per aircraft, delivered by tanker ships that submarines could sink. The round trip consumed nearly 12 hours, pushing crews and aircraft to operational limits. Japanese commanders calculated that mechanical failures, navigation errors, and exhaustion would eventually ground the American bomber fleet without Japanese intervention. Captain Yoshimitsu Sato, commanding the 47th Anti-Aircraft Battery, had trained his men to calculate the massive bomber's approach speed and altitude with slide rules and mechanical computers. The mathematics were predictable. B-29 seconds approached at 280 miles per hour, climbed at 1,200 feet per minute, and maintained formation integrity even under fire. Predictable targets, Sato declared, are dead targets. His gunners had developed firing solutions that accounted for the bomber's size and speed, leading their shots by precise calculations. This morning felt no different. 3 contrails in the distance, probably reconnaissance aircraft photographing damage from yesterday's raid. The laughter continued as soldiers finished breakfast, confident that another day of routine air defense lay ahead. 6,000 miles away on Tinian Island, Colonel Paul Tibbets stood in the pre-dawn darkness beside the most expensive aircraft ever built. The B-29 superfortress designated Enola Gay represented the culmination of American industrial engineering, a flying laboratory designed to deliver humanity's most destructive weapon. At 0245 hours, Tibbets watched his crew perform final systems checks on an aircraft that cost more than a small city's annual budget. The bomber's 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, represented technological mastery that Japanese engineers could only dream of achieving. The Superfortress program had consumed $3.2 billion, more than the Manhattan Project itself, transforming Boeing's Seattle facilities into the world's largest aircraft factory. Production lines, stretching for miles, manufactured bombers at a rate of 16 per day at peak output. Each aircraft contained 55,000 individual parts, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches, assembled by workers who understood they were building instruments of strategic devastation. The psychological impact on Boeing employees was profound. They knew their aluminum creations would determine the war's outcome. Weather reconnaissance reports from Captain Claude Etherly in the B-29 Straight Flush confirmed clear skies over Hiroshima. The meteorological requirements for atomic bomb delivery were precise and unforgiving. Cloud cover above 10/10 would scatter thermal radiation, reducing the weapon's effectiveness. Winds above 30 miles per hour would push the aircraft off target during the critical 43-second bomb fall. Surface visibility below 10 miles would prevent accurate targeting using the Norden bombsight. This morning, conditions were perfect for atomic warfare. In the briefing room, Major Thomas Ferriby, the bombardier who would release Little Boy, studied reconnaissance photographs of Hiroshima taken just 18 hours earlier. The target, the Aoi Bridge, stood out clearly in the aerial images, its distinctive T-shape providing an unmistakable aiming point. Ferriby had practiced bombing runs on similar targets in the Utah desert, dropping conventional explosives on mock Japanese cities built to exact scale. His accuracy rate exceeded 95%. The mathematics of nuclear targeting allowed no margin for error. The B-29's pressurized cabin, a revolutionary innovation that Japanese aircraft designers had never mastered, would protect the crew from the thin atmosphere at 31,000 feet. The aircraft's service ceiling of 36,000 feet placed it beyond the reach of most Japanese interceptors, whose engines gasped for oxygen above 25,000 feet. The superfortress's General Electric remote-controlled gun turrets, operated by computer-assisted fire control systems, could engage multiple targets simultaneously with deadly precision. Japanese pilots who had learned to exploit blind spots of earlier American bombers would find no such vulnerabilities. Captain Robert Lewis, Enola Gay's co-pilot, performed his final walk-around inspection as ground crews topped off fuel tanks with 7,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. The bomber's range of 4,100 miles with reduced bomb load made the round trip to Japan routine, though psychological pressure on crews remained enormous. Lewis had flown 37 combat missions over Europe, but nothing had prepared him for carrying humanity's most destructive weapon into combat. The weight of atomic warfare pressed on every crew member's consciousness. Meanwhile, Japanese radar operators on Shikoku Island detected 3 aircraft approaching from the southeast. The formation was dismissed as reconnaissance flights, too small to constitute a serious threat. Major Yoshio Yoshida, commanding the 344th Radar Company, had grown accustomed to American aircraft probing Japanese defenses with small formations. His standing orders required reporting formations of 50 aircraft or more. 3 bombers hardly warranted disturbing the regional air defense commander's breakfast. The Enola Gay's bomb bay had been modified extensively to accommodate Little Boy's unique dimensions. The uranium weapon measured 10 feet in length and weighed 9,700 pounds, requiring custom mounting hardware designed by Los Alamos scientists. The bomb's ballistic characteristics had been calculated precisely through extensive testing with identically shaped conventional explosives. Terminal velocity would reach 1,100 feet per second during the 43-second fall from release altitude to detonation, height of 1,968 feet above Hiroshima. Technical Sergeant George Caron, the tail gunner, monitored Japanese radio frequencies through his headphones, listening for signs of fighter interception. The Japanese pilots were discussing routine patrol assignments and complaining about fuel shortages that limited training flights. No mention of American bombers appeared in their transmissions. The psychological confidence that had sustained Japanese defenders for 8 months remained unshaken. They had no concept that a single aircraft could deliver destruction equivalent to 300 conventional bombing raids. At 0730 hours, Enola Gay crossed the Japanese coastline at Shikoku, beginning the final approach to Hiroshima. Below them, Japanese civilians began their morning routines. Workers reported to factories, children walked to schools, and soldiers manned anti-aircraft positions. None suspected that in 18 minutes their world would end in atomic fire. In a heavily guarded laboratory beneath the desert hills of Los Alamos, New Mexico, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer had spent 3 years transforming theoretical physics into humanity's ultimate weapon. The Manhattan Project represented the largest scientific undertaking in human history, employing 130,000 workers across 37 facilities in 13 states. The uranium enrichment process alone required more electricity than entire cities consumed, draining power grids from Tennessee to Washington state. What Japanese intelligence dismissed as American industrial excess was actually the methodical construction of atomic warfare capability. The physics of uranium-235 fission had been understood since 1939, when Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split uranium atoms in their Berlin laboratory. But transforming laboratory curiosity into military weapon required engineering miracles that pushed American industrial capacity beyond all previous limits. Natural uranium contained only 0.7% fissile uranium-235, mixed with 99% uranium-238 that could not sustain chain reactions. Separating these nearly identical isotopes demanded technologies that had never existed. The gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, covered 44 acres under a single roof, making it the largest building ever constructed. Inside, uranium hexafluoride gas was forced through thousands of barriers containing microscopic holes, each barrier removing tiny fractions of uranium-238. The process required 4,000 stages of separation, consuming 25,000 kilowatts of electricity per hour. The plant's power consumption exceeded that of Chicago, requiring new dams specifically to support atomic bomb production. Little Boy, the uranium weapon now suspended in Enola Gay's bomb bay, contained 64 kilograms of uranium-235 enriched to 80% purity. This represented 18 months of combined output from Oak Ridge's facilities. The weapon's gun-type design was deceptively simple. A uranium projectile would be fired into a uranium target, creating supercritical mass that would trigger uncontrolled chain reaction. The physics were so reliable that Los Alamos scientists had not bothered testing the design. Mathematical calculations guaranteed success. The critical mass calculations had been performed by teams of female mathematicians working with mechanical calculators, each woman computing fragments of equations without understanding their ultimate purpose. Security compartmentalization meant that only a handful of scientists comprehended the weapon's complete design. These human computers performed calculations that would determine the fate of Japanese cities with slide rules and adding machines, never knowing their mathematical precision would vaporize hundreds of thousands of human beings. Dr. Luis Alvarez, flying in the instrument aircraft accompanying Enola Gay, carried scientific equipment designed to measure the atomic explosion's characteristics. His blast gauges and seismographs would record data determining the design of future nuclear weapons. The psychological weight of participating in humanity's first use of atomic weapons pressed on every scientist involved. They understood they were crossing a threshold from which civilization could never return. Meanwhile, Japanese physicists, led by Dr. Yoshio Nishina, had been pursuing their own atomic research since 1941. The Japanese Army's No. 2 research program had explored uranium enrichment using thermal diffusion methods, but resource shortages and Allied bombing had crippled their efforts. By 1945, Japanese scientists had produced less than 1 gram of partially enriched uranium, while American facilities were producing kilograms monthly. The industrial gap was insurmountable. The electromagnetic separation process at Oak Ridge employed mass spectrometers the size of locomotives, using magnetic fields to separate uranium isotopes by their minute weight differences. These calitrons required silver borrowed from the Treasury Department's reserves to wind their massive electromagnets. The United States literally melted down silver coins to build atomic weapons, demonstrating resource commitment that Japan could never match. American industrial capacity had transformed nuclear physics into assembly line production. Each component of Little Boy had been manufactured to specifications measured in thousandths of inches, tested repeatedly and assembled by technicians who understood that mechanical failure could prevent nuclear detonation. The weapon's arming mechanisms, timer circuits, and proximity fuses represented engineering precision that Japanese military technology could not approach. The Trinity test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, just 3 weeks earlier, had proven that atomic weapons could generate explosive yields equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT from a device weighing less than 10,000 pounds. The flash had been visible for 200 miles, the blast heard for 100 miles, and the mushroom cloud had climbed to 40,000 feet. Witnesses described feeling the heat on their faces from 10 miles away. Dr. Oppenheimer had quoted the Bhagavad Gita upon witnessing the Trinity explosion. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." The psychological impact on scientists who had created atomic weapons was profound and permanent. They understood that human civilization had entered an era where single weapons could destroy entire cities. Japanese military planners, completely unaware of atomic weapons development, continued preparing conventional defenses against an enemy that had transcended conventional warfare. At 31,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Enola Gay's crew settled into the mechanical routine of high-altitude flight. Captain Robert Lewis adjusted the autopilot settings as the superfortress maintained course toward Hiroshima, its Wright R-3350 engines consuming fuel at precisely calculated rates. In the bombardier's compartment, Major Thomas Ferriby studied aerial photographs of his target through the Norden bombsight's precision optics. The Aoi Bridge's distinctive T-shape stood out clearly in reconnaissance images taken 18 hours earlier. Everything proceeded according to mission profile rehearsed dozens of times over Nevada desert. Below, the Japanese home islands appeared deceptively peaceful in morning sunlight. Rice paddies formed geometric patterns across the landscape, punctuated by villages whose inhabitants were beginning their daily routines. Steam locomotives pulled freight cars loaded with military supplies along railroad lines that would cease to exist in 30 minutes. Factory workers reported to manufacturing plants that would be reduced to radioactive rubble before lunch breaks. The psychological disconnect between normal life continuing below and the atomic weapons suspended in Enola Gay's bomb bay created surreal tension among the crew. Flight Engineer Sergeant Robert Schumard monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption with obsessive precision. Each Wright R-3350 engine was performing within specifications, oil pressure steady, cylinder head temperatures optimal. The superfortress had been stripped of all defensive armament except tail guns to reduce weight and increase range. This modification eliminated 7,000 pounds of armor plating and machine guns, allowing the aircraft to carry Little Boy's massive bulk while maintaining operational altitude. The psychological effect on crew members was significant. They flew defenseless except for speed and altitude. Navigator Captain Theodore Van Kirk calculated their position using celestial navigation techniques refined during hundreds of training flights. His sextant readings confirmed they were precisely on course, timing perfect for the planned 0815 hours bomb release. Japanese radar stations had detected their formation but dismissed 3 aircraft as insignificant compared to massive raids they had grown accustomed to repelling. The psychological advantage of appearing harmless had worked perfectly. No fighters scrambled to intercept the most important military mission in human history. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant George Caron monitored Japanese radio frequencies through his headphones, listening for signs of fighter interception or air raid warnings. The radio chatter revealed routine morning communications between ground controllers and patrol aircraft. Japanese pilots were discussing fuel shortages that limited training flights to 15 minutes, complaining about mechanical problems, and requesting permission to return to base due to engine troubles. The deteriorating condition of Japanese air power was evident in every transmission. Weather reconnaissance aircraft commanded by Captain Claude Etherly radioed confirmation that Hiroshima remained clear of clouds. The meteorological requirements for atomic bomb delivery were unforgiving. Surface winds below 10 miles per hour, visibility exceeding 10 miles, cloud cover below 3/10. These conditions occurred infrequently over Japan during summer months, making this morning's clear skies a fortunate coincidence that would determine the atomic age's beginning. Alternative targets included Kokura and Nagasaki, but Hiroshima's perfect weather sealed its fate. Radio operator Private Richard Nelson maintained contact with Tinian Base while monitoring emergency frequencies for distress calls. The communication protocols were minimal to maintain operational security. Code words would signal mission success or failure, but detailed reports would wait until after landing. The psychological burden of radio silence weighed heavily on crew members, who understood they were crossing a threshold from which civilization could never return. Japanese air defense commanders remained oblivious to the approaching catastrophe. General Yoshijiro Umezu, commanding the 2nd General Army headquartered in Hiroshima, was reviewing intelligence reports that predicted conventional bombing raids against industrial targets. His staff had calculated that American B-29 formations typically numbered 100 to 300 aircraft, making the three-plane formation approaching Hiroshima insignificant. The mathematical assumptions that had guided Japanese air defense for 8 months were about to be shattered by physics they could not comprehend. At 0809 hours, 6 minutes before bomb release, Enola Gay began its final approach to the initial point. The crew donned dark glasses to protect their eyes from the atomic flash that would follow. Captain Parsons armed Little Boy's firing mechanisms, transforming an expensive scientific experiment into a functional nuclear weapon. The arming process required removing safety plugs and connecting electrical circuits that would trigger uranium fission. One mechanical failure could prevent nuclear detonation. The psychological preparation for atomic warfare was impossible. No human being had ever deliberately triggered nuclear weapons against civilian populations. The crew understood they were about to change warfare forever, but the full implications remained beyond comprehension. Below them, 350,000 Japanese civilians continued their morning routines, unaware that in 6 minutes their city would become humanity's introduction to the atomic age. At 0815 hours and 17 seconds, Major Thomas Ferriby pressed the bomb release switch. Little Boy separated from Enola Gay's modified bomb bay with mechanical precision, beginning its 43-second journey toward atomic history. The uranium weapon tumbled through thin air at 31,000 feet. Its ballistic trajectory, calculated by Los Alamos physicists who had never imagined the human consequences of their mathematical equations. Captain Parsons's arming mechanisms functioned perfectly, transforming 64 kilograms of enriched uranium into humanity's first military nuclear weapon. Colonel Tibbets immediately executed the escape maneuver, rehearsed hundreds of times over Nevada desert, banking Enola Gay into a violent 155-degree diving turn that subjected the crew to crushing G-forces. The superfortress's airframe groaned under stress loads that pushed Wright-R 3,350 engines beyond normal operational limits. Every crew member understood that survival depended on achieving maximum distance from ground zero before nuclear detonation. The mathematics were unforgiving. Insufficient separation meant vaporization alongside their target. Below, Japanese civilians continued their morning routines, oblivious to the falling weapon that would redefine human warfare. Office workers climbed stairs in concrete buildings that would collapse in 37 seconds. Children walked to schools that would be reduced to radioactive ash before first period began. Factory workers operated machinery that would be melted into unrecognizable metal fragments. The psychological disconnect between normal life and approaching apocalypse created a surreal tableau of innocence about to be shattered forever. Little Boy's internal mechanisms operated with clockwork precision as the weapon fell through increasingly dense atmosphere. Barometric pressure sensors measured altitude, calculating the exact moment for nuclear initiation. The gun-type design required split-second timing to achieve maximum destruction. Too high, and thermal radiation would be absorbed by atmosphere. Too low, and the weapon would crater harmlessly into Earth. Los Alamos scientists had calculated optimal detonation height at 1,968 feet above Hiroshima's streets. Staff Sergeant George Caron, monitoring instruments in Enola Gay's tail turret, watched Japanese radio frequencies for signs of comprehension. The transmissions remained routine, discussing patrol assignments and fuel shortages. No air raid warnings, no emergency broadcasts. Japanese defenders had dismissed 3 aircraft as insignificant, never imagining that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Their confidence in conventional warfare assumptions was about to be obliterated by atomic physics. At 1,900 feet above the Aoi Bridge, Little Boy's proximity fuses detected optimal detonation altitude. Electrical circuits closed, triggering conventional explosives that fired a uranium projectile down a gun barrel into a uranium target. The two subcritical masses combined to form supercritical assembly, containing more fissile material than required to sustain chain reaction. Nuclear physics took over with awesome inevitability. Uranium-235 atoms began splitting at exponential rates, releasing energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The nuclear fireball materialized instantly, reaching temperatures of 100 million degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the core of the Sunday. Every material substance within half-mile radius vaporized immediately, including concrete buildings, steel structures, and human beings who simply ceased to exist. The psychological concept of instantaneous death took on new meaning, as people were transformed from living beings to atomic particles faster than nerve impulses could register pain. Their shadows were burned permanently into stone surfaces. Thermal radiation traveled at light speed, igniting everything flammable within 2 miles of ground zero. Wooden buildings exploded into flames before sound waves arrived. Human skin caught fire at distances exceeding 1 mile from the hypocenter. The temperature at ground level reached 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper coins and fuse glass bottles into unrecognizable shapes. The physics of thermal destruction operated beyond human comprehension. The shock wave followed milliseconds later, traveling outward at 7,200 miles per hour. Concrete buildings designed to withstand earthquakes crumbled like sandcastles as overpressure exceeded 100 pounds per square inch. Steel frame structures twisted into abstract sculptures of destruction. The Hiroshima castle, standing for 400 years, collapsed in seconds. Human beings caught in the open were thrown hundreds of yards by winds that exceeded hurricane force. Captain Robert Lewis, observing the destruction from Enola Gay's cockpit, wrote in his log, "My God, what have we done?" The mushroom cloud was climbing toward their altitude, a pillar of radioactive debris that would contaminate the atmosphere for decades. The psychological impact on crew members was immediate and permanent. They had crossed the threshold from conventional warfare into atomic age, from military victory into moral uncertainty. The blast was visible from 200 miles away, a second sun rising over Japan that could be seen from Tinian Island. The shock wave circled the Earth, recorded by seismographs in distant countries. Humanity had announced its entry into the nuclear age with a demonstration that made conventional weapons obsolete forever. The fireball expanded with physics that defied human comprehension, reaching a diameter of 1,200 feet in the first second after detonation. At ground zero, temperatures exceeded those found in the core of stars, vaporizing everything within a half-mile radius instantly. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall stood 500 feet from the hypocenter. Its steel and concrete structure, designed to withstand earthquakes, melted and twisted into an abstract sculpture of atomic destruction. The building's occupants simply ceased to exist, their atomic particles scattered by nuclear forces. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, who had laughed at American bombers just minutes earlier, was manning his anti-aircraft gun 2,000 yards from ground zero when Little Boy detonated. The thermal radiation reached him before the sound, igniting his uniform and burning 60% of his body in milliseconds. The shock wave followed, throwing him 200 yards through the air like a broken doll. His Type 88 75mm gun, weighing 3,000 pounds, was lifted from its concrete emplacement and hurled into a nearby building. Conventional weapons had been rendered obsolete in microseconds. The psychological shock for Japanese defenders was immediate and total. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, who had boasted about shooting down B-29 seconds, was flying his Ki-84 Hayate at 15,000 feet when the atomic flash lit the sky brighter than the Sunday. The electromagnetic pulse disabled his radio and damaged his engine controls. Through his canopy, he watched Hiroshima disappear beneath a mushroom cloud that climbed toward his altitude. The city he had sworn to defend no longer existed. His confidence in Japanese military superiority evaporated with the smoke rising from atomic ground zero. The blast wave traveled outward at 1,100 feet per second, faster than sound, crushing everything in its path with overpressures that exceeded 100 pounds per square inch. Concrete buildings designed to survive earthquakes crumbled like children's blocks. The Hiroshima castle, built in 1591 and symbol of samurai power, collapsed in seconds. Its massive stone foundations, which had withstood centuries of natural disasters, were reduced to rubble by atomic forces. If atomic weapons could destroy Japan's most sacred structures, nothing was safe. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of Hiroshima Communications Hospital, was reading morning reports when the atomic flash burned through his office windows. The building shook as if struck by a giant hammer, then began collapsing around him. Glass shards embedded in his face and arms as he was thrown across the room. When he regained consciousness, he found himself buried under debris in what had been a modern medical facility. Medical equipment worth millions of yen had been reduced to radioactive scrap. The thermal effects were beyond anything in human experience. At ground zero, surface temperatures reached 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and bronze. Human beings caught in the open were reduced to shadows burned into concrete sidewalks, their bodies vaporized so quickly that only silhouettes remained as permanent testimony to atomic warfare's power. Roof tiles fused together into glass-like substances. Metal objects melted and reformed into abstract shapes that defied identification. Captain Yoshimitsu Sato, commanding the 47th Anti-Aircraft Battery, had calculated firing solutions for B-29 formations using mechanical computers and slide rules. His mathematical precision meant nothing against atomic weapons. The blast wave reached his position 3,000 yards from ground zero, traveling at speeds that made conventional projectiles seem motionless. His carefully positioned guns were scattered like toys, their crews killed instantly by overpressures that crushed human bodies. Scientific calculations that had guided Japanese air defense were rendered meaningless. The mushroom cloud climbed to 40,000 feet, carrying radioactive debris that would contaminate the atmosphere for decades. Pilots flying missions over Japan reported seeing the explosion from 200 miles away, a second sun rising over the empire. The psychological effect on Japanese military personnel was catastrophic. If single American aircraft could destroy entire cities, resistance was futile. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had been overwhelmed by atomic fire. 15 kilotons of explosive force had been released in microseconds, equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional TNT. The energy density was incomprehensible. All the explosives dropped on Japan during 8 months of B-29 raids had been exceeded by one weapon weighing less than 10,000 pounds. The mathematical relationship between mass and energy, expressed in Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, had been demonstrated with horrifying clarity. The laughter that had echoed from Japanese anti-aircraft positions just minutes earlier was silenced forever. Those defenders who survived would never mock American bombers again. They had witnessed the birth of atomic warfare, the transformation of matter into energy, and the obsolescence of everything they had believed about military power. The age of conventional warfare had ended at 0816 hours. In the first minutes after atomic detonation, Hiroshima transformed from a functioning city into a radioactive wasteland that defied human comprehension. The mushroom cloud climbed relentlessly toward the stratosphere, carrying with it the vaporized remains of 80,000 human beings who had simply ceased to exist. At 40,000 feet, the atomic cloud spread outward like a malevolent umbrella, visible to pilots flying missions 200 miles away. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Japanese aircrew reported seeing a second sun rising over their homeland. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of Enola Gay, struggled to process what he had witnessed from the aircraft's observation windows. The city, that had been clearly visible in aerial photographs just minutes earlier, no longer existed. In its place, a roiling column of superheated gases and radioactive debris climbed toward their altitude with terrifying speed. Lewis wrote in his flight log with shaking hands, "My God, what have we done?" The crew's psychological preparation for atomic warfare had been inadequate. Nothing could have prepared them for witnessing the complete destruction of human civilization in seconds. 11 miles away from Ground Zero, Enola Gay's instruments detected gamma radiation levels that would have been lethal to unprotected humans. The aircraft's aluminum skin provided minimal shielding against atomic byproducts that would contaminate the atmosphere for decades. Technical Sergeant George Caron, monitoring radiation detectors in the tail compartment, reported readings that exceeded the instrument's maximum scales. The crew understood they were flying through radioactive clouds that represented humanity's introduction to nuclear contamination. Below the climbing mushroom cloud, survivors emerged from the ruins of what had been Japan's 7th largest city. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of Hiroshima Communications Hospital, crawled from beneath collapsed concrete beams with glass fragments embedded in his face and arms. The modern medical facility where he had worked for 15 years was reduced to twisted steel and radioactive rubble. His colleagues were either dead or so severely burned that identification was impossible. The thermal effects had created injuries beyond medical comprehension. Patients stumbled through radioactive debris with burns covering 80% of their bodies, their clothing fused to melted skin. The pattern of their kimonos was burned permanently into their flesh, creating grotesque textile impressions on human tissue. Many survivors suffered from flash blindness, their retinas seared by light brighter than the sun's surface. Those who had looked directly at the atomic flash would never see again. Radiation sickness began affecting survivors within hours of the explosion, though its symptoms were unknown to Japanese physicians. Victims who appeared relatively uninjured began vomiting uncontrollably, losing their hair and bleeding from their gums. Their white blood cell counts dropped precipitously as radiation destroyed their immune systems. Dr. Hachiya observed patients dying from mysterious ailments that had no known treatment. The atomic age had introduced medical conditions that exceeded human understanding. The electromagnetic pulse from the nuclear detonation had destroyed communication networks throughout Western Japan. Radio transmissions ceased abruptly at 0816 hours, creating an information blackout that prevented Japanese authorities from comprehending what had occurred. Military commanders in Tokyo received no reports from Hiroshima because no functional communications equipment remained. An entire city had simply disappeared from Japan's command structure. Firestorms erupted across the devastated area as superheated air ignited everything combustible within a 3-mile radius. Wooden buildings that had survived the initial blast wave burned with temperatures that exceeded normal combustion, fed by atomic-generated winds that reached hurricane intensity. The traditional Japanese architecture that had withstood centuries of natural disasters was consumed by radioactive fires that burned for days. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, commanding Enola Gay, radioed a coded message to Tinian Base. Mission successful. The 2 words represented the most significant military communication in human history. confirming that atomic weapons had been successfully deployed against civilian targets. The psychological burden of that transmission would haunt Tibbets for the remainder of his life. American photo reconnaissance aircraft, dispatched hours after the bombing, found no recognizable landmarks in what had been Hiroshima. The city's street patterns had been erased, its buildings reduced to atomic shadows, its population transformed into radioactive statistics. The Ioi Bridge, which had served as the bombing target, was twisted beyond recognition, but still partially standing. The mushroom cloud was visible from Tinian Island, 1,500 miles away, as a dark smudge against the morning sky. Ground crews preparing for subsequent atomic missions could see the evidence of Little Boy's success rising into the stratosphere. They understood they were witnessing the birth of warfare that transcended all previous human experience. 3 days after Hiroshima's destruction, the B-29 Boxcar lifted off from Tinian Island carrying Fat Man, a plutonium implosion weapon that represented the pinnacle of American nuclear engineering. Major Charles Sweeney commanded the mission that would demonstrate atomic warfare's inevitability to Japanese leaders who still believed surrender could be avoided. The primary target was Kokura, an industrial city housing Japan's largest arsenal. But weather conditions would redirect history toward Nagasaki. At 0347 hours, August 9th, 1945, humanity's second atomic mission began with mechanical precision. The psychological impact of Hiroshima had shattered Japanese military confidence, but Emperor Hirohito's government remained paralyzed by internal divisions between surrender advocates and military extremists who preferred national suicide to capitulation. General Korechika Anami, war minister and leader of the resistance faction, argued that atomic weapons were American propaganda designed to accelerate Japanese surrender. His staff calculated that America possessed only one atomic bomb expended on Hiroshima. The mathematical logic seemed sound. No nation could produce multiple nuclear weapons with such devastating power. Fat Man represented technological advancement beyond Japanese comprehension. Unlike Little Boy's gun-type uranium design, the plutonium weapon employed implosion physics that compressed fissile material to supercritical density using precisely timed conventional explosives. 32 detonation points fired simultaneously, creating a spherical shock wave that compressed plutonium to twice its normal density. The engineering tolerances required microsecond timing accuracy that pushed American manufacturing capabilities to their absolute limits. Each component had been tested hundreds of times. Captain Frederick Bock, piloting the instrument aircraft accompanying Boxcar, monitored Japanese radio frequencies for signs of interceptor activity. The transmissions revealed complete confusion among air defense commanders who had received no coherent reports from Hiroshima. Communication networks remained severed, creating an information vacuum that prevented coordinated response to American operations. Japanese fighters scrambled randomly, wasting precious fuel on futile patrols, while atomic bombers approached their targets unopposed. Weather reconnaissance over Kokura revealed cloud cover exceeding mission parameters for atomic bomb delivery. Captain James Van Pelt, Boxcar's navigator, calculated course corrections toward the secondary target, Nagasaki, Japan's oldest Christian city and site of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. The irony was profound. The city that had welcomed Western civilization in the 16th century would become the second victim of Western atomic warfare. Historical coincidence had selected targets based on meteorological conditions rather than strategic importance. At 1058 hours, Bombardier Captain Kermit Bayhan acquired visual contact with Nagasaki through a break in the cloud cover. Fat Man's ballistic computers calculated the optimal release point as the aircraft approached the Urakami Valley at 31,000 feet. The weapon separated from Boxcar's bomb bay with the same mechanical precision that had characterized Little Boy's release 3 days earlier. 43 seconds later, plutonium implosion created the second artificial sun in human history, demonstrating that atomic warfare had become America's standard military capability. The explosion generated 21 kilotons of destructive force, 40% more powerful than Hiroshima's uranium weapon. The Urakami Cathedral, largest Christian church in Asia, vaporized instantly along with 8,500 worshippers attending morning services. The psychological symbolism was devastating. If atomic weapons could destroy God's house, no structure in Japan was sacred. The blast wave traveled outward at supersonic speeds, crushing steel-reinforced concrete buildings and liquefying human beings caught in thermal radiation. Captain Charles Sweeney, observing the destruction from Boxcar's cockpit, reported to Tinian Base using the same coded language that had announced Hiroshima's destruction. Mission accomplished. The clinical terminology masked the horror below, where 70,000 Japanese civilians had been killed in microseconds. The psychological burden of atomic warfare pressed equally on American aircrew who understood they had crossed moral thresholds that would haunt them forever. Japanese monitoring stations detected the second atomic flash and finally comprehended the technological reality facing their nation. Intelligence analysts who had dismissed Hiroshima as a unique demonstration now understood that America possessed multiple atomic weapons and the industrial capacity to manufacture them indefinitely. The psychological foundation of Japanese resistance crumbled as military leaders realized they faced an enemy whose technological superiority transcended conventional warfare. Emperor Hirohito, meeting with his Supreme War Council in an underground bunker beneath Tokyo, received reports that made continued resistance impossible. 2 cities had been erased by single aircraft carrying single bombs. American industrial capacity could produce atomic weapons faster than Japan could rebuild destroyed cities. The mathematics of nuclear warfare were irrefutable. Surrender became inevitable not because Japan lacked courage, but because atomic physics rendered courage irrelevant. The mushroom cloud over Nagasaki climbed to 60,000 feet, carrying radioactive debris that would contaminate the atmosphere for decades. Japanese pilots flying reconnaissance missions reported seeing the explosion from 300 miles away, eliminating remaining illusions about technological equality. The age of samurai warfare had ended permanently. August 15, 1945. The voice of Emperor Hirohito crackled through radio speakers across the Japanese Empire, delivering words that would end the most destructive war in human history. His high-pitched, ceremonial tone spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Japan surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had accomplished what 4 years of conventional warfare could not. Nuclear weapons had forced the capitulation of a nation that preferred death to dishonor. In underground bunkers beneath Tokyo, Japanese military leaders who had laughed at B-29 formations just weeks earlier now faced the mathematical reality of atomic warfare. General Korochika Anami, war minister and leader of the resistance faction, had committed ritual suicide hours before the emperor's broadcast, rather than accept surrender. His final words spoke of shame that Japan's military might had proven inadequate against American technological superiority. The psychological transformation was complete. Officers who had boasted about shooting down American bombers now understood they had been fighting with obsolete weapons. Colonel Ichiro Sanada, formerly commanding officer of the 244th Air Defense Regiment, sat in stunned silence as radiation reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached his headquarters. His anti-aircraft guns, which had claimed dozens of B-29 seconds over 8 months of combat, were rendered meaningless by weapons that killed entire cities in seconds. The mathematical calculations that had guided Japanese air defense were obsolete. No amount of conventional firepower could intercept atomic destruction delivered by single aircraft. The psychological impact on Japanese civilians was devastating and permanent. Survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, described witnessing the transformation of matter into energy, the vaporization of human beings, and shadows burned permanently into concrete sidewalks. Their testimonies revealed the horror of atomic warfare in human terms that transcended military statistics. Children who had been walking to school simply ceased to exist. Mothers searching for their families found only radioactive ruins where homes had stood for generations. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of Hiroshima Communications Hospital, struggled to treat medical conditions that had no names or treatments. Radiation sickness manifested in symptoms that defied medical understanding. Patients who appeared relatively uninjured began dying from mysterious ailments that caused hair loss, uncontrollable bleeding, and immune system collapse. The atomic age had introduced diseases that exceeded human medical knowledge, creating warfare casualties that would suffer for decades. American occupation forces arriving in Japan discovered a population psychologically shattered by atomic warfare. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the occupation, reported that Japanese resistance had evaporated completely. The same military culture that had produced kamikaze attacks and fought to the death on Pacific Islands had been broken by the demonstration of American nuclear superiority. The psychological foundation of Japanese military philosophy had been obliterated by physics. Intelligence reports from occupied Japan revealed the extent of psychological transformation among former military personnel. Fighter pilots, who had attacked B-29 formations with suicidal determination, now worked as farm laborers, their confidence in military aviation destroyed by memories of atomic flashes. Anti-aircraft crews, who had calculated firing solutions with mechanical precision, now understood that their mathematical expertise was worthless against weapons that operated beyond conventional understanding. The industrial statistics that had sustained Japanese resistance were revealed as catastrophically inadequate. While Japan had produced 3,514 Ki-84 fighters during the entire war, the United States had manufactured 15,586 P-51 Mustangs and 3,970 B-29 Superfortresses, plus the industrial infrastructure to support atomic weapons development. The mathematical comparison was devastating. American production capacity had exceeded Japanese capabilities by orders of magnitude, making defeat inevitable. Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender was based on reports that made continued resistance impossible. American industrial capacity could produce atomic weapons indefinitely, while Japan lacked the technological capability to develop countermeasures. The mathematics of nuclear warfare were irrefutable. Each atomic bomb eliminated more Japanese civilians than died in months of conventional bombing. If single American aircraft could destroy entire cities, no defensive strategy could protect the Japanese population. The laughter that had echoed from Japanese anti-aircraft positions on August 6th had been silenced forever by atomic fire. Those defenders who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never again mock American bombers or calculate firing solutions with mechanical confidence. They had witnessed the birth of nuclear warfare, the transformation of theoretical physics into military reality, and the obsolescence of conventional military thinking. The age of atomic weapons had begun with the complete psychological defeat of an enemy who had never surrendered in their 1,000-year history. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had been overwhelmed by American nuclear fire. The samurai spirit had been broken by industrial physics. September 2nd, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender as B-29. Superfortresses flew overhead in precise formation. The same aircraft that Japanese defenders had once mocked as aluminum overcast now dominated the sky above Japan's capitulation ceremony. The psychological symbolism was deliberate and devastating. American bombers that had been dismissed as vulnerable targets were now the instruments of absolute victory, their presence a reminder that atomic warfare had rendered conventional military thinking obsolete. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, former Ki-84 pilot who had boasted about shooting down B-29 seconds, stood among the defeated Japanese delegation wearing a dress uniform stripped of military decorations. His psychological transformation from confident fighter ace to humiliated witness reflected the broader collapse of Japanese military culture. The man who had once calculated interception courses with mechanical precision now understood that individual courage was meaningless against weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. His laughter at American bombers had been silenced by atomic fire. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, survivor of Hiroshima's atomic blast, sat in a military hospital with burns covering 60% of his body. The anti-aircraft gunner, who had joked about flying coffins, now served as living testimony to nuclear weapons power. His Type 88 gun emplacement had been reduced to twisted metal, his crew vaporized, his confidence obliterated by physics he could never understand. Mathematical calculations that had guided his targeting solutions were rendered meaningless by weapons that operated beyond conventional logic. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, documenting radiation exposure effects, wrote detailed observations of injuries that had no precedent in medical literature. Atomic bomb survivors exhibited symptoms that defied classification: mysterious bleeding disorders, immune system collapse, and cellular damage that would continue for decades. His hospital records became humanity's first documentation of nuclear warfare's biological consequences. The psychological burden of treating injuries caused by weapons that transformed matter into energy weighed heavily on medical personnel. American occupation forces discovered a Japanese population psychologically shattered by nuclear superiority demonstration. Intelligence reports described former military personnel who had abandoned all resistance. Fighter pilots who had attacked B-29 formations with suicidal determination now worked as laborers, their confidence destroyed by memories of atomic flashes. The transformation was complete. Japan's warrior culture had been broken by industrial physics. The industrial statistics that emerged after surrender revealed the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory. American aircraft production had exceeded Japanese capabilities by factors of 10. The United States had manufactured 299,293 aircraft during the war, while Japan produced approximately 76,320. In B-29 superfortresses alone, America had built 3,970 bombers, more than Japan's total heavy aircraft production. The atomic bombs represented the culmination of industrial capacity that Japan could never match. Colonel Paul Tibbets, pilot of Enola Gay, participated in victory ceremonies, knowing that his crew had crossed a threshold from which humanity could never return. The psychological burden of atomic warfare affected American personnel as profoundly as their Japanese targets. Crew members who had witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki's destruction understood they had participated in warfare that transcended conventional military experience. Their clinical reports masked emotional trauma that would haunt them. The technological revolution, represented by atomic weapons, had fundamentally altered warfare's mathematics. Nuclear fission released energy equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives from devices weighing less than 5 tons. The physics involved made traditional military calculations obsolete. Fortifications that could withstand artillery bombardment were vaporized by atomic fire. Armies that could repel conventional attacks were rendered meaningless by weapons that killed entire populations. Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, became living witnesses to humanity's entry into the nuclear age. Their testimonies described the transformation of human beings into atomic shadows, concrete buildings' vaporization, and injuries that would affect generations through genetic damage. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass an entire civilization's understanding of warfare's possibilities. The laughter that had echoed from Japanese anti-aircraft positions on August 6, 1945, had been silenced forever by atomic weapons that demonstrated conventional military thinking's obsolescence. Those defenders who survived atomic attacks would spend their remaining lives as witnesses to humanity's capacity for destruction that transcended natural forces. They had learned technological warfare's hardest lesson, that courage and determination were meaningless against weapons that operated through physics. The B-29 superfortress, once dismissed as an easy target by Japanese defenders, had become the delivery system for humanity's most destructive weapons. The psychological transformation from mockery to absolute fear represented more than military defeat. It marked the end when individual heroism could overcome technological superiority. The atomic age had begun with complete psychological destruction of enemies who had never known defeat. The divine wind had been conquered by nuclear fire,